Our next presentation is the hangover effect, seagrass loss and macroalgal growth in Charlotte Harbor following the 2017 and 2018 red tide event. Dr. Chris Anastasiou is going to be presenting on this. He's with the Southwest Florida Water Management District. The purpose of this presentation is to update the committee on how SwiftMud utilized seagrass maps, aerial imagery, water quality data, and hydrodynamic modeling to support the idea that the hangover effect, at least in part, led to the greatest loss of seagrass in Charlotte Harbor over the last 30 years. This relates to the water quality improvement priority actions, and specifically to support the comprehensive and coordinated water quality monitoring and assessment strategy. So, Chris, I'll hand things over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad we're ahead of schedule. I think I might be able to help with that. I'm known sometimes to go a little long, so I apologize up front if I do. What I'm going to talk about today is this idea of what I've dubbed the hangover effect. Actually, I give credit to Jay Leveroni, who actually coined the term back in 2019. Many of you may have already seen this presentation. I originally gave it at the UF Water Institute symposium back in February, and then I also gave a slightly modified version at Basis last month. So for those of you who were at either of those meetings, some of this will probably be very familiar to you. But basically what I wanted to do today was kind of share this this idea with the group and hopefully get some feedback. It's an idea that I've been working on for a while, and really speaks to the most important question beyond the question of what do you do about it, which is the causality. So why did we see what we saw in Charlotte Harbor? And a lot of the seagrass data that I'll show you should not be new to anybody, but I think it's good to go through it and then maybe talk a little bit more about some of the underlying causes for what we had witnessed along the east wall of Charlotte Harbor specifically. So without further ado, go ahead, next slide. Just to remind the group, the Southwest Florida Water Management District is 16 counties, and Charlotte Harbor is down on the very southern end there. So as a SWIM program, the Surface Water Improvement Management Program, of which Mark Walton and I are both a part of, we have 12 what we call SWIM priority water bodies that we manage. So we're kind of spread out across the entire district and across the entire region. But Charlotte Harbor and the Charlotte Harbor Estuary is definitely near and dear to my heart. I've been working in that system for about 20 years. So I have a lot of good memories and good sea stories of working in the harbor. And it's a really unique system too. So not only is it the second largest open water estuary in Florida, but it also has a really large watershed to open water ratio. As you all know, it's about 12-1. If you compare that to the sister systems to the north, Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay have a much smaller watershed to open water ratio. For example, Tampa Bay is only 6-1. So Charlotte Harbor's got twice as much surface water draining into it than Tampa Bay and way more than Sarasota Bay. So it makes it a unique system for us to manage. We don't usually see these types of freshwater inflows in our estuaries within our district. So it's unique. For those of you who are familiar with our SWIM plans, so each of the 12 SWIM priority water bodies have plans associated with them, and we recently updated the Charlotte Harbor SWIM plan in 2020. And what we've historically had and adopted is what we consider a hold the line strategy on nutrient management. Reason being that when we look at the gauged portion of the Pisa-Mayaca watersheds, there's virtually little to no increase in the amount of total nitrogen and phosphorus loading into the harbor. And so for that reason, we sort of take a hold the line strategy. That does not mean do nothing by any stretch of the imagination. It means doing a lot in order to maintain where we are. And part of that was based on a lot of work that we did looking at water quality data for the harbor and the rivers. And in 2017, and it's important to remember, we're talking about up to 2017, we didn't see any evidence of degraded water clarity. There was really no evidence of increasing chlorophyll, TP or TN. In fact, both of those nutrients by and large were relatively low. So overall, the conclusion of the swim plan was that the harbor is relatively healthy. Again, remember, 2017. And it's important also to note that just because we say that the harbor is relatively healthy does not mean that it is pristine. By no means do we suggest that. In fact, way back in 2000, Gene Turner did a really good report, actually it was 2006, but he looked at nitrogen loads from 2000 and compared them to historical, what we estimate were the historical loads back in the 1800s. And what he found was that the nitrogen loading in Charlotte Harbor in 2000 was 3 times greater than what we believe it to be back in the 1800s. So yes, hold the line, not seeing any huge increases in nutrient loads in the watershed, but absolutely not pristine. So that's really important to remember. And that's why we take a lot of effort and a lot of time to map seagrass in this estuary. Again, I think you all should be pretty familiar with our seagrass mapping program. We've been mapping grass in Charlotte Harbor actually since 1982, but our imagery started in 88, and we continue to do that on a 2-year cycle. And just again to refresh your memory on where we were in 2018. So really no trend, a little slight increase in seagrass from about 2010 to 2016. Life was good, no real trends, everything is kicking, everything looks great until 2018. And then as again, you all know, in 2020, we saw that really sharp drop in seagrass acreage. We lost about 4,400 acres. That's about 23% of the grass that we mapped in 18 was gone in 2020. And what I really want to focus on today is the east wall, and specifically that northern section of the east wall. Why? Because if you look at the table at the very top, you'll see that the northern, that what we're calling Eastern Charlotte Harbor North, really represents more than half of the loss in grass. So that's really our hotspot. And if we kind of zoom in, oh, sorry, next slide. I thanks for keeping up, but I should have been telling you guys next slide. I'm sorry. I forgot. I'm looking at mine. Yes, so can you advance to the next slide? And then the next one. Sorry about that. And then the next one. Yeah, I got ahead of my own presentation. Sorry. And one more. All right, so that's where I was pointing out that the east wall really is kind of ground zero for the bulk of the loss of seagrass. So next slide. And so what I want to do now is kind of spend some time focusing in on the east wall of Charlotte Harbor. So if we just look at that segment, you can see that we had a really sharp decline from 18 to 20. And a couple of things I want to just point out here. One is that one of the inherent limitations of our seagrass maps is that we're really mapping the spatial extent of the seagrass. We're not really mapping the health of the grass. So if there are sublethal stresses on these grasses, but the signature shows that they are either continuous or patchy seagrass, they're going to get mapped that way. So that's why we rely really heavily on the stuff that Mindy's group does, all the good boots on the ground observations that we get from Dave Blewett and others. The transect work that the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves is doing in the system is invaluable and has been a really big help, and will factor into what I'm going to show you here in a little bit. But I just want you to keep in mind, in 2018, we had fairly good seagrass acreage, but it does not imply that the grasses were necessarily healthy. They may have been, but that's not what the maps are showing. The maps are just showing the acreage. So from 18 to 20, big loss, about half the acreage of seagrass that we mapped in 18 was gone by 2020. And so what this does is it sort of begs the question, why, right? I mean, that's really what is most important and key is, what is the underlying cause of this loss? And so next slide. So what I did was I kind of took a forensic perspective and tried to piece together some of the events that were going on and other observations. So again, I mentioned Dave Blewett and his crew. This is a photograph from August of 2020. And even prior to this, we were starting to get reports of large mats of this filamentous algae, which we now have identified as Caulerpa fastigiata. Whether or not it is Caulerpa fastigiata, I think the consensus is that it is, but it's a type of colurbid that I've never really experienced before. And we know there's other types of algae out there as well. I swear the picture on the right is chaetomorpha, but they tell me it's colurbid. So either way, there's a lot of filamentous algae that came into this east wall, and we have evidence of that beyond just the loss of seagrass. Next slide. And then, as I talked about with the aquatic preserves transect data, they also collect a lot of these site location data. And these are two plots from Mindy's group that shows both the abundance of drift algae over time and the abundance of seagrass over time at these fixed locations. Next slide. And so what you see is a sharp increase in 2018 of drift algae along this eastern wall. And in 2019, a rather sharp decrease in seagrass. But again, I'll call your attention to the bottom left figure where you see in 2016, you started to see a decreasing trend. So again, there may have been other factors that are going on that resulted in that 2020 loss. But no doubt from 18 to 20, we did see a very sharp decline. And so her data and her group's data support what we're seeing in the maps, which is good. But again, it begs the question, why? So let's go back and kind of recreate history and see what happened in the moments leading up to and then following this crash of seagrass along the east wall. So next slide. So you guys are all very familiar. If you were here in 2017, Hurricane Irma made her appearance and caused a lot of damage up and down the West Coast. And the eye wall really passed within about 30 kilometers of the eastern wall. So it was really close. And at that point in time, it was a Category 2 storm. So a lot of hurricane activity with the passage of Irma. And again, that bottom left figure that I took from a paper that Dave Tomasco and others published back in 2020 really kind of brings home that point that if you're in a condition where the grasses are experiencing a sublethal stress, a hurricane could be enough to really change the trajectory of a seagrass meadow. In and of itself, though, one would be hard pressed to explain the loss of grass based solely on the passage of Hurricane Irma. Why? Well, because hurricanes have been happening for millennia. And so these systems are fairly well adapted to the passage of these, what we would consider catastrophic events. Next slide. But then, of course, everybody also is acutely aware of what happened shortly thereafter the passage of Hurricane Irma, which was the red tide event, the worst red tide event that NOAA has recorded in its recorded history. And this red tide event really started in October of 17 and lasted all the way into January of 2019. Some can argue it was actually two events that were sort of sandwiched together. But the point is that over that period, which was a very relatively long period, we had a lot of red tide out there. And that, of course, caused, as we all know, quite a bit of damage, both in terms of fish kills and not only ecological, but economic damage as well. But there's something important about this figure on the right. Next slide. And that is Charlotte Harbor. If we look at Charlotte Harbor, specifically the east wall, it was largely spared the brunt of the red tide event. Were there impacts? Absolutely. But was it ground zero? No. And I looked at this now, this is just one snapshot in time, but I looked at the data that went across the entire red tide event. And Charlotte Harbor proper, especially the east wall, was relatively free of red tide. So again, it begs the question, could red tide been the causative factor for why we lost that seagrass? And so this is kind of where the whole concept of a hangover effect comes in. Perhaps it wasn't the red tide itself following the passage of Hurricane Irma, but maybe it's what happened afterwards. Next slide. So I took a figure from some work that was done by Dye et al. In 2020, and they are by no means the only group that has looked at circulation dynamics. There's been hydrodynamic models and circulation models for Charlotte Harbor since like the 1980s, the early 80s. And so we're fairly comfortable with how water circulates in Charlotte Harbor. And one thing that's very important to note is that when conditions are right, you will get this counterclockwise flow of water in Charlotte Harbor. Water from the Peace Myaca River comes down, follows the west wall. Well, what happens? The stuff from south and even west of the harbor proper then gets entrained along the east wall. And we think this is actually what may have happened during and shortly after the red tide event. That bottom right panel of those series of graphs shows after day 20 of running the model that most of the particles that started out in the Caloosahatchee River ended up moving up through Pine Island Sound, past Bokeelia, and up the east wall. So again, this is circumstantial, which is why this is really more of a hypothesis. But there's circumstantial evidence to support the fact that what may have happened was the water that was coming in from the red tide event may have been at least partly to blame for some of that explosion of filamentous algae and subsequent loss of seagrass. But that, again, isn't enough to explain it. So what I wanted to do is key in on certain parameters. And the one that I really keyed in on, and the one I want to talk about here today, is ammonia. Next slide. So why ammonia? Because there's been some work that was done in Charlotte Harbor. So Kilberg and Thorson published a paper back in 2014, along with Cindy Heil's group when she was back at FWRI back then. And they published work that was looking at the release of nutrients from fish carcasses, both in Charlotte Harbor and offshore in what they call the blue water area of the Gulf of Mexico. And what they found in both cases is that ammonia released from decaying fish can be a very significant and acute nutrient source. And the key word there is acute. Why? Because this was an event that happened, that water could have moved up into the east wall, and then you could have seen this ammonia release. Now, fortunately, we have water quality data, again, thanks to our partners down in the Charlotte Harbor region that I used. So I went to the Water Atlas. We looked at the data from these various stations, and what we see is that figure right in the center of the slide, which is a significant rise in ammonia concentration in the water column in 2019. So that, again, further supports this hypothesis that this post-red tide water mass could have moved into the east wall, become entrained there, not only because of the circulation, but also because if you're familiar with the east wall, you know that there's a longshore bar. And that longshore bar tends to hold stuff between the bar and the mangrove fringe. And so you've got two effects there that could have caused that water to sit long enough for that ammonia to be released and then taken out by the filamentous algae. And one other thing that kind of supports that claim is some work that was done a couple of years ago. And they were looking at Caulerpa proliferus and not the same species. But what they found was that about 80% of the total, 81% of the total nitrogen that's acquired is in the form of ammonia. So at least for Caulerpa prolifera, we know that they preferentially will uptake ammonium. And so if you release all this ammonium into the water column, there's like, imagine the ammonia release being the party keg, and the Caulerpa just chowing down on it and having a great time. So I think there's enough evidence to support that this is, at least in large part, the causative factor behind why we saw so much filamentous algae along the east wall. But how much how much ammonium did we really see? I mean, we see concentration data, but how does that link back to this whole idea of dead fish and decaying algal cells? Next slide. So what I did, and this is all hypothetical. So I took a 2,000-ton dead fish value. And where I got that number from was basically looked online, and I looked at all the various media reports around Southwest Florida, and everybody sort of, and this may be way off, but it seemed like 2,000 tons was the agreed upon amount of dead fish that were harvested, mostly along the beaches where people recreate. So I just took that number as a baseline to say, all right, let's just use 2,000 tons. And based on that work that was done by Kilberg and Thorson and others back in 2014, I was able to calculate or estimate a total nitrogen load coming from 2,000 tons of dead fish. And so what I calculated was about 12,700 kilograms dry weight of total nitrogen into this east wall area. Now, to give you kind of an idea of what that is, and you look at the total load that's coming into Charlotte Harbor from Myakka and Peace River, and you divide that out by 12. So again, this is just a hypothetical example, but if you divide the total load coming into the Charlotte Harbor from the Peace Myakka River by 12, and you get a monthly average, 12,000 kilograms dry weight represents about 10% of the average monthly load coming into the into the harbor from the entire watershed. So it's not an insignificant amount of total nitrogen that could have been made available to these filamentous algae. The other thing I did was I looked at the actual dead seagrass. Next slide. So this was based on work done by Jim Forkran and Jay Zeman back in 2002, and also some work prior to that done by Dave Tomasco and Penny Hall and others. And they were looking at the nitrogen release from dead seagrass. So you lost 1,760 acres of seagrass along the east wall. What does that equate to in a total nitrogen load? So I calculated that based on the work that they did, and I came up with a range of about 6,200 to almost 14,000 kilograms dry weight of total nitrogen that could have been made bioavailable in the water column. That's about double, that doubles the amount that would have come just from the dead fish. So you're looking at potentially 20% of the monthly load of nutrients into the entire harbor being dumped right on the east wall. And so that could be a large reason why we saw that proliferation of filamentous algae. But again, keep in mind, 2,000 tons is not the amount of dead fish collected along the east wall. That was an estimate based on what was collected in Southwest Florida. We really don't know how much dead fish or really how much decaying material there was along the east wall. So that's a big question mark, but this kind of gives us a ballpark estimate as to what it could have been. Next slide. So really the last thing I want to do is just kind of sum up the whole concept of what we're calling a hangover effect. And it's a hangover effect because basically you had sort of two wild nights in quotes, with both dead fish and nutrients released by the dead fish, and then potentially the dead seagrass and nutrients released by decaying seagrass material. So it's a 1-2 nutrient punch. The Caulerpa and other filamentous algae had a major party. And then we're starting to see evidence, and I don't know if Mindy's on, if she's at the meeting today, or Dave Blewett for that matter, but we are starting to see a decrease in the percent covered, not the aerial extent. There's still a lot of algae out there, but in terms of just the percent cover of that algae, it has started to decrease. So it could be that now that the hangover is starting to dissipate, things are slowly maybe starting to get back to normal. It's too soon to tell, but that's sort of where we hope the system is headed, is back towards something that it looked like prior to this event. Next slide. And I can't thank all our partners enough. You know, none of this work could be done without working in a team environment. So again, I thank everybody and all the input and all the hard work and all the feedback on trying to piece this story together. And the last slide is just my contact information. If anybody has any questions or wants to get more information after the meeting, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. And that's it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Anastasiou. Really great presentation. I mean, that's a really thought-provoking hypothesis you've got there. It definitely makes sense, and you know, hopefully we see kind of maybe the seagrass start to rebound now that things have sort of started to come back to normal. I know we had at least one question in the chat from Chris Kaufman. He states, first of all, great presentation. Do you know, or did you do any review of the fish kills mapped from the data from the FWRI in 2019 and compare that to locations of high ammonia along the eastern wall?
Yeah, hey Chris, good to virtually see you. I did look at the data, but and I have to double check, but I don't remember seeing any numbers from the east wall specifically, because I checked that, but I will go back and recheck and make sure, because I'm not 100% sure about that. So that's a great idea. Appreciate it.
And then Jennifer Hecker, you had was that a response to Mr. Kaufman's question, or did you have something else to add there?
I had a comment. First, Chris, thank you for that excellent presentation. And I did want to mention that Dave and Mindy and others are in the room here. So we're all appreciating this. I wanted to let you know that the theme of the last CHNP Policy Committee meeting was on red tide, and that some of the presentations that we had directly relate to this. We had a presentation from FGCU researchers on the effect of decomposing fish on prolonging red tide events. And we also had a presentation from Pinellas County on a proactive local government red tide response example, where it involved them paying a contractor who in turn employed fishermen to remove dead fish from waterways, and that they found some positive results in response to taking those actions. So just encourage those of you who are interested in diving further into this topic to check out those videos. They are posted on the chnep.org Policy Committee webpage, and I put that link in the chat for those of you who are online. But I did want to call your attention to the fact that this really reinforces some of the presentations from other scientists we heard as well, who have made that connection to the decomposing fish and the need to try to intercept and remove those from the waterways as much as possible and as quickly as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. That's really great news. And if ever we need any further document, it sounds like there's a lot of work, and there is, I know, a lot of work in looking at the effect of decomposing fish. But certainly, I think this could be a good presentation to show direct impact to help fund those types of responses, because as I think that's really important. We focus a lot on beaches and waterways and canals where people live, but even we can't forget the open water areas and these areas where we know through just being looking at the hydrodynamics are prone to junk sitting there, that those might be areas to target as well. So thanks for that info.
Yeah, I would add one last thing, which is those of you who are working with local governments who are interested in this Pinellas, they have provided the scope with their emergency response contractor, and it is linked on that policy committee webpage. So you can actually look at the language that they put together to have this entity ready on standby, so that when they're hit with these events, they're already set to jet from a procurement standpoint to get those people out immediately. So I just thought that's something to kind of pass along in case others are interested in and trying to.
And Jennifer, they're documenting the tonnage of fish that they're pulling up, right? They're not just out there collecting it. They're actually giving us, how much fish they're recovering.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. And I think it's been a few months since we saw those presentations, but I think they might have covered some of that in their presentation for those of you who want to review those.
I got a question. This is Ernesto Lazo de la Vega. Chris, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for all the work that you're doing. My question is regarding the monitoring, the seagrass monitoring effort that has been done for every year. That has tremendous, and I want to thank all the volunteers, well, including myself. I've been in that group. But I want to know if Chris have seen a transition between the composition, the different type of composition of drift algae in sort of like it's going from one type of drift algae to another type. You mentioned something like, I wonder, I just want to pick your brain a little more about that, because I want to tell those response to the volunteers that I'm working with.
Yeah. No, good hearing from you, Ernesto. I know you and I talked I think it was Basis. You and I got to chat, and good to hear your voice. Yeah, and I know Mindy's in the room, so this might be a better Mindy question, but I'll tell you, with Cholera fastigiata, one of the weird things about that species is it does well both as a filamentous algae, what we would consider a textbook drift algae, but it also has holdfasts, and those holdfasts, we find them, and we actually picked up Cholera fastigiata in the 2020 maps, and we'll probably do so again this year. You can tell when it's algae because it's got a different signature, but it will live as drift algae, but it can also attach itself to the substrate. And again, this is hypothetical, but it's an idea that what I think anyway, based on the literature and based on just my experience, might be happening is it's a drift algae so long as there's enough nutrients available in the water column. But once those nutrients are expended, then it may start to become more of an attached algae. The reason being that in that report or that paper that I quoted or that I cited in my presentation, about 81% of the nutrients being preferred by Caulerpa, and again, this is prolifera, but I think can be transferable to Fastigiata, is in the form of ammonia. What else they found is that some, up to 10 or maybe even 20% of its nutrients can actually come from the sediment through these holdfasts. Now, obviously, it's not a higher plant, so it doesn't have rhizomes and a root system, but it actually can uptake nutrients from the sediment through these little, what they call rhizoids, these little holdfasts. So again, it's total observation, but it could be what we're seeing is a shift from once the party's over and the hangover's worn off and there's no more nutrients in the water column, what Caulerpa is left might actually attach itself to the substrate. And we do see that. And Mindy can probably confirm or deny that. But I've seen it out there along the east wall where they actually, attach to the sediment. And that may give them a little extra boost of nutrients. Just a thought. There is, as you said too, there is other algae out there. It's not all just Caulerpa. You've got some of your Gracilaria and some of your other species. But I'll turn it over to Mindy to expand on kind of the species composition that we're seeing out there. And yeah, I'll just say one more thing though. That map that I showed you from Mindy's group showed Caulerpa fastigiata in the upper part of the east wall. Kind of goes to a different type of algae the further down you get it. And then as you get around Pine Island Sound and you go down towards Bokeelia, which is outside of our district, it definitely shifts. And I've seen that. You get kind of more of what I would consider your typical drift algae species once you get down that far. But I don't know, Mindy, if you had any further comments on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris, too, for kind of putting together all of, Dave and I have been chatting about all of these theories about how this possibly happened. And so I think this presentation really does a good job of summarizing all of that. And the ammonium is really interesting. So yeah, there's two kind of different surveys that we've been doing. So that boat survey you've been talking about, we go out with FWC and Seagrass and you guys, the water management district, just to kind of get an idea of the extent and like the distribution of this filamentous algae, this green that we've been seeing since late 2019, I think now along the east wall. And so, yeah, there is a transition like south of Bernstrom Marina on the east side is where it kind of
You have to go back to that map.
transitions more towards like a red algae. And then once you get into Matlacha Pass too, we've been seeing this green filamentous. And this year, it seems like the green filamentous is really taking off in Matlacha Pass now, but along the east wall of Charlotte Harbor, that green filamentous algae is
Right there, that map.
yeah, so this is the map that we do by boat, like every mile with partners every January for the past 2-3 years now. 3
Yeah,
years.
3 years.
3 years. Just to get an idea of the extent. And this year we did the west wall into Turtle Bay as well. So we're seeing the green filamentous on the west wall now too. But before that, and then so on the left side of this presentation, we also look at algae abundance on our seagrass transects. So this is just showing one of our transects and we look at algae and seagrass. So before that, like it's typical drift algae, the red algae, Acanthophora and Gracilaria, typical species. And then you can see that big jump in 2018. That was the green filamentous algae
2012 and 15 too, really, remember?
on the west wall. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
On the west wall, a different transect, we did see a certain green filamentous algae in 2012, which we identified as Dapis. So it might have been the same species now that we're thinking about it, but something happened in like Chris's presentation in 2018. It just like proliferated along this whole from Punta Gorda all the way down.
And I'm sorry, Mindy, so MC03 is like right kind of in the middle of this map. Yeah.
You see like part harbor, it's north of that.
Yeah.
just a little bit north where that big green dot is. Yeah, right around there. So yeah, has been this transition of algae species that we've been documenting through our transect and through these boat surveys in summary. If that answers your question. But thank you, Chris, for
And Ernesto, I'll just add one other thing too. And Mindy, you can chime in too if you want. But my experience historically along the east wall is that a lot of the grass that we used to see was Thalassia. And I think, Mindy, in having conversations with you, that there is some areas where we're seeing grass come back, but is it mostly Haladuli that you're seeing come back, or is it also some Thalassia?
Yeah, along the east side of that sandbar, it was like very Thalassia turtle grass dominated.
Yeah.
That's the species. And with this algae, we saw it literally being smothered by this algae in like big mats 2 feet thick. And you could see it turning brown and dying. And now like there is sparse Thalassia, but it's more recovered on the west side of the sandbar now. On the east side, it's still very sparse. The seagrass is sparse. And there's more, I would say, Haladuli now. So hopefully the turtle grass will come back to what it was before.
And one of the really important parts of this, and I know the guys at Mode have been hitting this theme for years, is that it's as important to document recovery as it is to document the loss. And one of the things that I don't think Brad Furman's at the meeting, but maybe he is. But Brad's been doing work, and I think might be doing work in Charlotte Harbor, but I know he's been doing work with Dave Tonasco's group up in Sarasota Bay, and they're looking at like viability of rhizome material. Once you lose the grass, how quickly does the below ground material disappear? Because if you don't have a root source, if you don't have a seed source, then recovery could take a lot longer than perhaps it would if there was a viable below ground biomass. And there's a couple of really good talks at the UF Water Institute about hypoxia and loss of below ground material based on hypoxic conditions as a result of these algae just kind of draping themselves over the sediment. So I don't know if any cores have been taken along the east wall, but it sounds like, because Mindy, your group is seeing some recovery, maybe there's
we've had Brad's group down, and we're trying to do sediment cores to see what seed source is currently there on the east wall and down in the mountains too. So if there are going to be restoration efforts in the future, we know what seeds are there and if they could potentially like start growing even this summer. So yeah, that's something that we're
cool.
Now.
Yeah, that's really important, is to know that. And I know that some of the work that was done at Sarasota Bay around Longbar Point suggested that, the conditions right now should be optimal for seagrass growth, but we're not seeing that much seagrass. And it may be because, based on his cores, there's not a whole lot down there in the below ground material. So it'd be really interesting to see what he comes up with here. So definitely keep us posted.
Yeah, I think we had to reschedule. So he's coming back out in a few weeks. And then we're going to try to monitor this transect next week too, just to see what's currently there. So yeah, in progress.
Yeah, let me know what you find out.
So we had one other follow-up question. I don't know if Jennifer, you have the answer to that, but Chris Kaufman asked if FWRI is documenting fish species on the the red tide mortalities.
I'm muted, Dave, if you have anything. Or
questions about stocking?
No. Hi, everybody. This is Chris. Sorry, I was just going to provide clarification. So I was just wondering, with the Pinellas County scope, if they include not only weight of the collected dead fish, or if they're recording any significant species, or identifying any species that they're collecting. And I'm sure Dave can describe this better, but during the Redfish Summit and a few others, they provided presentations on how they're trying to get a better handle of mortality for, say, the redfish during red tide events.
Yeah, I don't believe it wasn't mentioned anyhow. I haven't reviewed the scope in great detail, but it is posted online as an attachment to the policy agenda that was on last cycle, which is still up on our webpage at that link. So you might want to take a look at that, and feel free that the gentleman who presented is actually the project manager. So he might be a good contact to reach out directly to. But, I mean, the thing is, they were really just focused on how to balance like rapid response and using kind of laypersons. They wanted to employ the fishermen that were put out by the red tide, to actually help with responding to the red tide. So I don't know if they had the capability, given, the kind of use of these citizens, to be able to do that. And I think it was also a matter of like getting those rapidly moved to facilities for disposal and things like that. So, but I do believe they did collect weight and things of that nature. So if you want to check that out online or reach out to him directly, he probably can answer that better than I can.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think maybe just, for future events, having the opportunity to connect those types of project managers with the counties that are going to be doing that work with research biologists at FWC, to see if there's any connection to coordinate, once the collection of the dead fish are available, if anyone wants to do additional species identification or weight. So thank you. Just wheel spinning. Thanks.
I love it. I think that is a really interesting opportunity, and I'm sure he would welcome that if there are people interested in kind of using that for research data. Our goal was just to really, again, make these connections. And I think this presentation today reinforces it about why those investments are justified and what kind of benefits can a community expect if they choose to make that kind of investment, because, obviously there's costs involved and whatnot. But we wanted to make sure to communicate the ecological benefits and the economic benefits, apparently, that they experienced in Pinellas as a result of this program they've set up, and see if other communities in Southwest Florida were interested in trying to follow suit.
So again, thank you, Dr. Anastasiou. Really great presentation. In the effort to keep things on schedule here, we're gonna have to move along to the next presentation. If you do have any other questions, Chris, would you mind posting your email address in the chat so that folks can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I just have one really quick follow-up. I'm not looking for an answer, but just Chris's comment got me thinking. Maybe some of the fish people at the meeting might know this, but I was just curious how species differences might affect the amount of total nitrogen released into the water column as those carcasses decay. I don't know if anybody has any references or any insight, but I will give my email in the chat, and if anybody wants to talk more about it, please feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks.